That's wonderful, Jack.
Yep. Yep. And for those of you listening at home, the uh, the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective, we're now available for parties. So if you're having a party and you'd like to book us, we're available.
I'll be back in just a moment. We'll get going then.
Yep. Yep. So, what's the deal with airline food?
Boom, 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 boom.
Hi there.
Guten Tag.
Guten Abend.
No sprechen Sie Deutsch.
It's just in the evening here.
I don't know. It sounds kind of dirty to me. Are you sure it's not code?
Nope.
You're not sure, or it's not code?
Not as far as I know. Or maybe everyone is flirting with me in the evening, I guess.
You heard it first here, folks. Triad, most eligible bachelor in Germany. Also available for parties. I have to ask, what are German parties like? Does everyone like sit around and like go over symbolic logic, or how does that happen?
It really depends on the party. Sometimes there are just these parties at the countryside in old gyms, so to speak, or the city halls that are at the same time for the sports of the school kids, and at the weekend it's just partying and a lot of drunk people and a bit redneckish, and in the cities total escalation at some point. Not as crazy as the Britons, but there's a lot of alcohol in Munich, Berlin, Frankfurt, etc. In some underground techno clubs. There's a lot of other drugs, thrilling, throbbing techno. Yeah.
And
The
this
usual
all
stuff.
Wonderful.
happens to the backdrop of Kraftwerk, yes?
Yeah, sometimes at some retro parties, you can actually hear and dance to Kraftwerk.
All right. Well, with that wonderful discussion, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Thank all of you for joining us on what is the last of our first run of Anti-Oedipus here on the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective. This has been a crazy, weird ride, and I thank all of you for joining. Some of you have been here since the first one, so that's no small feat. I can personally attest to that. The goal of today is a little bit different than our other roundtables. We're still going to do some good reviewing, so that way those of you who are wanting to have a better understanding of Anti-Oedipus can do so. But we are going to dive into what I think is important for us to do before we move on from this text or before anything else, which is, to me, to discuss the praxis. What can we do with this? What is there to do with? And really, ultimately, that is the subject of the final chapter of Anti-Oedipus, the discussion of what schizoanalysis is, how it works, what the tasks are within it, and how we can utilize it in our everyday lives. They discuss it quite a bit from the position of a therapist, but it's very, very clear this applies in a lot of ways. So we will be doing a larger discussion around all of that. This is going to be just a weirdly emotional thing for me because we're actually ending this reading. It's very strange for me, but I just want to say thanks. Any last announcements, any things before we move on to the discussion today? Well, I'm going to say literature has a wonderful announcement. Our reading this Saturday, please join us as the literature group reads Good Country People by O'Connor. Is that fair, Jack? I just had to.
Oh yeah, I
sorry.
was gonna let you do it anyways. I voted for Pynchon's Gravity Rainbow, right?
Of course you fucking did. Finally, it's my reward for sticking around so long and starting the server and everything. We finally get to read O'Connor and discuss it, which I've been wanting to since it was on the first poll for literature. I think after we did our toe, it was on the first poll after that. So I'm excited for that reading. Please do join us. It would be great. It's this Saturday. You can find copies in a lot of places. We also have a lot of other readings and a lot of other stuff happening on the server. Please, as you're listening to this at home, or if you're here on the server and you're looking to get involved in any of our other readings, head to our server calendar. It's up in the top there, and you can see all the other readings from Foucault to Simondon. We're starting a new group on Zen Tao and where it crosses over with Deleuzian thought. That's starting on March 6th, which is, I believe, evening, 7 p.m. We have a Science of the Philosophy of Science reading group, which is going, and we could absolutely use more people in. It's an amazing server. Please take some time, join some readings, and see what's out there. So, where to start today? This is a difficult one because as this is our last reading, as I said, we have a chance to have sort of a larger conversation around some of these bigger things. The question for me becomes, how do we start having a conversation about where we can go from here and what praxis is to these guys and to these writers and to these people? Jack found a wonderful selection where Deleuze and Foucault discuss praxis and theory and where they cross over. And I want to steal a handful of lines from that to set us off, and then we can start our discussion around schizoanalysis proper, diving into the meaning behind the chapter. And this will probably go beyond 2 hours because my goal by the end of this is for us to actually discuss what we can do, what we can produce, the things that can happen because of this effort. This was done in part simply because we want to read through Anti-Oedipus, but we are interested in Anti-Oedipus mostly, hopefully, not just for some clout of being cool people who've now read it and we can brag, but what can we do with this? What can this affect? How can we change things utilizing what we've been taught, what they say, and what the philosophy of this is? That is my goal today. We may not get there, but this is where I fucking want to be. But to that point, the lines I want to take from that article, there's a handful. The first is Deleuze is talking about, with Foucault, about sort of where theory meets praxis and how it works. And he says, at one time, practice was considered an application of theory, a consequence. At other times, it had an opposite sense, and it was thought to inspire theory, to be indispensable for the creation of future theoretical forms. In any event, their relationship was understood in terms of a process of totalization. For us, however, the question is seen in a different light. The relationships between theory and practice are far more partial and fragmentary. On one side, a theory is always local and related to a limited field, and it is applied in another sphere, more or less distant from it. The relationship which holds in the application of a theory is never one of resemblance. Moreover, from the moment a theory moves into its proper domain, it begins to encounter obstacles, walls, blockages, which require its relay by another type of discourse. It is through this other discourse that it eventually passes to a different domain. Practice, however, is a set of relays from one theoretical point to another, and theory is relay from one practice to another. No theory can develop without eventually encountering a wall, and practice is necessary for piercing this wall. That's the goal today, if we can find a way to pierce the wall and have that discussion. Chapter 4 is not a short section. In fact, this was probably the longest set of readings we had, and some of the very, very more difficult parts of this, as it essentially is bringing in all of the points that they've previously made, showing how they apply not only to the unconscious, but to the real world, to social fields, and to other things. So I want to go through, and I think we should, Jack, I think you agree, we go through a handful of terms, and then we'll get into what are essentially the postulates of schizoanalysis. Is that fair, Jack?
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that one.
So the first of these is really where they start in this chapter, is the concept of the social field. The social field at large is essentially the molar regime and the way that social machines sort of construct and build around inside of that. Their first point about the social field, and again, a lot of this is intended to be what they would call the first destructive task of schizoanalysis, which is taking down psychoanalysis and a lot of its postulates and the way it works. The way that they talk about the social field is in contrast to the family being essentially where a lot of these things come from, which is the psychoanalyst take. Instead, they would say that the familial and social are a chicken and egg problem. You can easily say that one causes the other, and that the other is also caused by the other. They kind of go around in a circle. Jack, did you want to expand on this a bit? Because I know you were doing the notes on this a bit earlier.
Yeah. So it's just like with the molar molecular, right? We're talking about two perspectives of effectively the same thing in a sense, right? So with the molar, we're focusing on desiring production under determinate conditions, such as the socius, right? And in the molecular, we start to see desiring production, how it plays into that, but also how it's affected by that. In a similar way, psychoanalysis, for Deleuze and Guattari at least, will begin with the familial in the same way it begins with the child and walk that out into the social, right? The problem with that, though, is there's no contingency here, right? We're starting from something of a representation and then kind of deducing from that. For Deleuze and Guattari, it's not like we have the familial before the social, right? In fact, to talk about the familial in lieu of the social is kind of strange, right? Because now we're talking about a family, right? Daddy, mommy, me, that has no social context. Kind of impossible, right?
Very much, very much. And it stems from, as they discuss inside of this, the biggest problem they have with a lot of that is they sort of laugh about how the way Oedipus works is actually it creates the child first and then visits the guilt upon the father as part of that. Before the child believes or does literally anything to Oedipalize the father, that's very much the relationship that it says, Oedipus says, you need to have with your child. So it's this absurd cart before the horse situation with how the family is sort of placed as this, privileged thing in the creation of these problems.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're going to make this move to say the social does precede the familial, but both are social, right? So like the chicken and the egg, both are chickens, right? They're kind of the same thing in a certain manner of speaking. The move they want to make here is to say that the familial is an application or a kind of reduction of social investments. So the social investments that exist get applied or reduced in a certain manner of speaking into the familial. The other part is we don't begin with the child as within psychoanalysis. We're going to begin with the father, who is socially contingent, right? So the investments in a given society are going to determine what a father even is going to look like, and the connections that play into that. And this father will in turn pass guilt on, much like we saw in the primitive socius, where there's a kind of debt relationship.
And so as they expand this concept of the social field and they talk about the issues with specifically the familial and moving things a little bit further out, they start talking about the entire social field and the sort of contingent realities and how we sort of interact with those elements. They name this they name this matrix of all of the desire, unconscious social investments and the way desire works at this level as delirium. The use of this is kind of interesting. Basically, there's at the societal level, we have deliriums, and there's essentially two types of social investments. This is not the poles of delirium. This is the two types of investments. There's the paranoiac fascising, which is essentially a collapsing of options into hierarchy, into central sovereignty, the desire for things to be connected and an eternal cause for everything that happens. This is the ultra-fascist, I would say. The paranoiac fascising is that side of it. Then there's, on the opposing side, they call it the nomadic, which is a term they use a great deal into 1,000 Plateaus. And this is where they begin using the term schizorevolutionary, lines of flight, escape, the ability for a person to not necessarily be, intertwined into these larger social investments, but instead sort of concerned almost with its own immediacy and the connections that it is making. To quote it, as Jack has written in the notes, it assembles its machines and groups in fusion in the enclaves or at the periphery. I am not your kind. I belong eternally to the inferior race. I am a beast, a black, etc. These sort of two social investments make up sort of the delirium that they're talking about within society. It's the delirious interplay between all of this is sort of how that term sort of comes about. Now, sorry, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, to expand on that, it's kind of weird how they're laying this out, because they're going to say these are two types of social investments, not to be confused with two poles of delirium. The nuance here is really, it's very subtle, but it's the segregative and the nomadic as the two kinds of investment. And then it's like the schizophrenic and the paranoiac processes we get as our delirium here.
As universal and prescriptive also could be another way that I've seen people talk about this, where it's people discussing sort of how the universality of things, the ultimate connections, how everything can be connected, versus the I know things, I separate things out, I go at them, I'm prescriptive, I set them out. But this also gets into, as they start talking about the processes that ultimately belay these investments. And the paranoid processes is that of basically crowd macrophysics and the statistical gregariousness that there is within groups, especially groups that begin to separate themselves out, versus the schizophrenic processes, which are much more in line with the molecular, the flows and partial objects that are connected within things. There's the way that they talk about these two groups is one is a subject group and the other is a subjugated group, which is, I think, useful because the tonality here is very much talking about one placing themselves at the mercy of this totalizing, fascizing, paranoiac force, and the other one being fairly less concerned and more just being a subject sort of going around, connecting how it does. As they sort of talk, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that maybe it's good to understand it in this way, that the segregative aspect is something that is dividing into a specific yet settled order, so to speak, and the nomadic, as it is when we go forth with this figure, this metaphor of the nomad, is free wandering. He or she has no settled place, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, in terms of territorialities, right? At one level of the territory, right, with a paranoiac process, we have managing in the aggregate, or like gregariousness. So this is like, we can see this throughout social movements where, you are of this group, right? And that's the good thing to be, right? There's a wisdom there that's indicative of a kind of segregative code. With the nomadic, you don't even have the gregarious, right? You have these partial objects, more directly partial objects in the schizophrenic sense. So they're constantly connecting and connecting and changing, right? So the paranoiac and the segregative, there's a way in which difference is kind of integrated, as opposed to the schizophrenic. I'm using Pynchon to make this point, so looking at you here, Brutz, but for the schizophrenic, differentiation will happen more directly.
So before we move to the next thing to discuss, let's please, questions about the social field, family, social, nomadic versus paranoiac, segregative, anything we just discussed. Please, if you have questions, now's the time, because it's pretty important when we start talking about how schizoanalysis needs to function and how we need to talk about these things for this to be grasped at least moderately well. And I'm happy to sit with an awkward silence. I mean, I really am. I apologize to anyone listening on YouTube, but yeah.
Fortunately, Bosgird or Ghostbird, depending on your pig lad, has a question. And I will preface this answer by saying we will go into this much more directly with the Guattari group that is beginning more directly this Friday at 5 PDT, 5 p.m. PDT, or 1700. So Bosgird asked, can we discuss subject group versus subjugated group real quick? So one way we can see this, and this is like Guattari, if I'm not mistaken, actually drawing on some of Sartre's work to come up with this. So a subjugated group is a kind of serialization, right? So this is why I'm using Pynchon in terms of integration here. So when the serialization occurs in a group, difference at this level has this kind of Nietzschean gregariousness, as he calls it, or in the sense where things aren't that different, right? This is still a collectivity. Very importantly, this is still a collective. However, this is a collective where there's not a lot of differentiation possible, right? There's a certain fit that relates to sort of the segregative use of the disjunctive synthesis, right, to very specific codings and very specific subjectivities as well as connections. There's a lot of limitation here. In contrast, the subject group, this is at that more nomadic level where flows aren't really stuck, right? And actually, I think this is one of the clearest ways Guattari explains this in his early work, where a subjugated group is kind of like being stuck. So like colloquially, we say we're in a rut. Things aren't changing. Everything's, kind of stuck in itself. Desire can't really move anywhere else, right? It's kind of pent up. The subject group in this manner has the potentiality for enunciation and a differentiation of enunciation. All these different functions remain changeable as opposed to being kind of conserved.
Yeah, I would add, to me, the reasons that they specifically use the terms subject and subjugated is that the subjugated group effectively is at the mercy of representation. Like that's they're in service of representation. It's so integrated into what they do. Well, a subject is actually someone who's, in this case, able to sort of connect with their desiring machines and allow connections to form as they do, not being in service of representation. To me, that's a pretty key difference as well. All right. If there's no other questions on that, the sort of second big thing that we want to make sure we go over is, again, one of the key concepts that we've talked about throughout the entire reading, which is the molecular unconscious as a thing. Like, what is it? How does it work? Where does it, how do they talk about it in this? When they start talking about it here, it's important in a couple steps, and we've gone over a great deal of this, so I'm going to try to skip over some stuff, so forgive me. The first is how repression functions within it. That repression is not something that spawns from the ego or the subject, as psychoanalysis would have, but instead repression is something that is created through representation and placed into the molecular unconscious as a restriction, a blockage. These reduce and block and hold up libido, the core energy, the flows, to contain them. Ideally, generally speaking, this is done, not ideally, how to put it. This is done generally in service of representation that makes it in a direction, makes it take a very particular prescriptive shape. Couple, family, person, things like that. This is repression and how it functions. And this vitalism inside of it is a big part of what they're going to be talking about, and we'll be talking about shortly with schizoanalysis, because we need to be talking about where desires actually come from and how desire is functioning. Jack, did you want to expand on that?
Yes, and I'm going to ask you for your assistance here. Can you paste a picture of the diagram on page 282 in the chat? Taking that as an affirmative, because my man Brooks never lets me down.
I'll do that. Give me a second. Sorry.
Thank you, my friend. Okay, so That's absolute. I think that's dead on. Where to go from here? Okay. So as we're moving into this, right, we're talking about what schizoanalysis kind of helps us do, right, and how this theory and praxis are going to have this work on each other that we kind of roll out, right? Like Deleuze will talk about the toolbox and needing more than a hammer. So what's the arsenal of tools, and what's the problems that schizoanalysis can help us focus on? Just like Brooks is saying, right, we've got to deal with these problems of delirium and mania. And this becomes interesting is for Deleuze and Guattari, they're going to build out not only in the form of repression, but in terms of social production, desire and production, how schizoanalysis can deal with this. So just like you're saying, right, there is this problem of being stuck, yeah, or like a representation that can displace desire, or as we see in other things, right, this problem of uncoded flows, or more directly, like in capitalism, where we're dealing with deterritorialization and decoding as a primary process, right? Unfortunately, in some sense, but it's also an opportunity for us. So on page 282, they lay out this, we'll say it's a diagram, but there's two schemas we want to focus on here. They're going to lay out the first one, which is a kind of triangle. This is a pendulum from the perspective of like a universal clinical theory. So on one hand, we have the schizophrenic. On the other hand, we have paranoia. So on the one, decoding and deterritorializing. On the other, recoding and reterritorializing in a sense. And we have the soci in between, and then we hit the body without organs, right? This is one way of understanding this, where we're in this constant oscillation between the schizophrenic and paranoiac as a kind of delirium. Deleuze and Guattari are going to say it's no less correct, however, to draw this kind of straight line, right, which is the second diagram. And instead of dealing with an oscillation, we're going to deal with a flow of desire, right, or flows of desire that are passing through the different soci and are being reterritorialized and recoded in that manner until they hit the body without organs, right, which has two sides, the microscopic and the submicroscopic. For Deleuze and Guattari right here, this is very critical, because this is where schizoanalysis has a lot of power to offer us. In terms of the body without organs, right, we can either have a breakthrough or a breakdown. We can either pierce the wall, or we can rebound, which means we're going to go back to these different soci, which is going to be kind of a reactionary investment, right? At the revolutionary side, if desire does break through the body without organs in this manner, then a line of escape is opened up that allows the flow, in a certain sense, to take from the structure and from the codes and the territory here and change it, right? To introduce a differentiation, to kind of unstick it in the way that a small hole in a pipe, right? And what level it's a leak and things are escaping, but that also has the potential to burst the entire pipe, to change the entire system in a certain manner of speaking.
It's a great way to put it. Thank you, Jack. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And so again, the discussion here is about how these things can have an effect, what they can do on kind of the entire setup, but we need to be talking about how the molecular conscious works. We are trying to get beyond, and this is, I think, the big point of the entire second part of this chapter, get beyond representation to their materialist unconscious, this material that everything is made of, that things can connect and how they work, because representations are the bullshit. I don't know how else to put it. Representations are bullshit. Figure out what's actually happening is kind of, to put it really crudely, sorry. Yeah, that's putting it pretty crudely. One of the things they also bring up, and they say quite often, and you'll hear us sort of make references to this, is when they say find your non-human sex. The the phrase here that they use quite often is about sort of understanding that a lot of this does come from, libido as they say it. But non-human sex means how you sort of connect and do these things in a way that may not be how humans connect and reproduce or do sexual things or expel energy in that way. What is your non-human sex is their big point that they keep coming back to. It's a whole discussion to have unto itself. But if anyone has a way to expand on that, I'd love it. I couldn't find much work on non-human sex that wasn't deeply Atlantean, and I'm not in the mood for that.
Oh, I'm very much in the mood for that. But
Of course you are, Joe.
but the thing is that basically, like, we walk in this universe with Oedipus as our big bird companion, right? So it guides us everywhere we go, and we are basically, to put it very um, like bad actually, but like in the Matrix, you follow this path, and Oedipus is all around us. It's like the code we follow everywhere, and therefore we amount to nothing because Oedipus is a pretty um, like it doesn't have much to stand on. It's a myth. It isn't based on anything, and we don't amount to anything. Therefore, because we follow these rules, and that's the idea of Oedipus, that if you follow these rules, you basically don't um, get into trouble. There's this law of Oedipus where we don't fuck our mother or we become blind and monk and uh, need a cane to walk, etc. It doesn't end well for him at all.
No, it adds nothing. But then they have a line from Henry Miller that's great when he wrote about Hamlet. And the quote that they use is, Hamlet was undoubtedly a hero to himself, and for every Hamlet born, the only true course to pursue is the very course which Shakespeare describes. But the question to me is this: are we born Hamlets? Were you born Hamlet? Or did you not rather create the type in yourself? That use of myth, that use of representation that they're discussing here, and how these representations we believe are some sort of larger story about the innate nature and reality of how man behaves and how we strive and how we work, ultimately actually is leading us to create the type in ourselves, and they become almost self-replicating phenomena within our psyches and within capitalism, certainly.
Exactly. So you get to the point where you start like about Glar, for example, with his he solved that problem by introducing a violent clone of yourself, which accompanies you, and is of course not yourself, but it's a clone of you. So it's some sort of a self. So that is what I mean with basically the cyber sex, what is derived, from the non-sexuality that you want to see coming out of anti-Oedipus, which is of course hyper cyberized, if that's a word, because we live in times, where, well, we all connect here with computers or with mobile phones and with headsets and microphones, and it's very much an if I don't know if anyone has seen like Lane serial experiments, but it's very much like a heap of electronics plugged into one another endlessly, which results in this how should I put it? Results in this entity. Basically, it's not really you or me, but it's a thing in itself. And
Right. Well, it becomes connections as the sort of thing, and this is when we start getting into, and I want to, not to interrupt, but I want to make sure we stay on course, because this gets right into where we start talking about schizoanalysis. And schizoanalysis itself has essentially, let's say, 3 tasks. They say tasks. I would say functions, stuff to do, things like that. The first is a destructive. There is a destructive task. And that is what Joe is talking about here, where we essentially need to go through what a person is invested in. To quote, destroy. The task of schizoanalysis goes by way of destruction, a whole scouring of the unconscious. Destroy Oedipus, the illusion of the ego, the puppet of the superego, guilt, the law, castration. It is not a matter of pious destruction such as these performed by psychoanalysis under the benevolent neutral eye of the analyst, for these are Hegel-style destructions, ways of conserving. This is absolutely about what is it that a person believes that they are invested in? What is the myths they believe is the core parts of themselves? And our job is to find that not only within ourselves, but within each other, within the things we're reviewing, the things we're talking about, and destroy them. This is the destructive task of schizoanalysis. And it is really about finding those, destroying representations, theatrical schemes. I heard someone chiming in there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you're right about that, about the destruction of representations and that. To kind of expand on that point, really, that's what they're getting at with like the anthropomorphic representation of sexuality, right? That is to say, sexuality in terms of the human or in terms of like genitalia, if we want to walk into like the animal kingdom, right? They're going to say that sexuality is really more about the productive, the generative, and the reproductive, this kind of cycle that is full of connections and functions and subjectivities, right? That the unconscious does. So with that, right, this negative task is about destroying the representations. But in this, the representations serve, there's a reason this is a task, right? And not just something of like an attitude of negation. It's a task in the sense that the representations do show us something underneath them, right? There's something they belie. And that's, I don't mean essence here either. I'm talking about things being represented, right? There's something that gets represented, right? In this case, we might say partial objects. We might say disjunctive networks. This is what we're trying to get at.
Yes, and these tasks aren't to be thought of as a thing that we do in order. It's not an Evernote list with like check marks and we go, cool, I did that one. Now this one. Okay, cool, that one. These are things that are done in the process of schizoanalysis, which utilizes these tasks and the four, the four theses for the entire thing, sort of driving the idea of these working together and being how schizoanalysis essentially functions when dissecting investments and when, during the first positive task, discovering the actual nature, formation, and function of real desiring machines. Once you're beyond the point of representation, once you've realized where those are at or where you're fucked up from all of these different things, the second step of that is to continue deeper. As we've seen essentially through this entire text, this anti-Oedipus is a testament to the process of schizoanalysis. They saw Oedipus for what it was and they went, wait, what if we just remove representation as a thing? What if we just do away with that and we don't think about these investments, but instead we talk about the underlying way that a person's unconscious actually functions, where it connects, how it connects, what it does, all of these wonderful things. Is there more? Well, okay, well, let's have that discussion. And they started breaking it down for Oedipus overall, and this can be done with almost anything. And the point to get to is where you start talking about not full objects. Again, those are conceptions, those are representations very often. This is much more about getting to partial objects, understanding where they're at, the flows between them, how they connect, and what the real flows, the output, how does it work? What are you connected to? What are your non-human sexes, as they say? This is the essential, like, first real task of it. And it has a lot of different parts to it that I think we're going to go through a little bit. Do you want to go through it step by step, Jack, and sort of talk through as we have it in the notes?
Yeah, just for the sake of people following us at home, the chronological might be a little bit easier. But we can always jump around a little bit, like if we're talking about partial objects, right? That's going to be, I mean, we can go through any of these theses and talk about that.
Yeah, the partial objects being sort of the first one. The point of getting to that point where you're looking at partial objects as they describe them sort of overall is being able to see how they connect to each other as they are, not how they sort of understand themselves as a larger object or a larger representation. So to quote, with every structure dislodged, every memory abolished, every organism set aside, every link undone, they function as raw partial objects, dispersed, working parts of a machine that is itself dispersed. In short, partial objects are the molecular functions of the unconscious. And as you're able to start getting at these and understanding really where desiring machines are at and how they're connecting, you can start putting together and getting a little bit more intuitive with how the flows and connections of these partial objects function. To quote, every partial object emits a flow. It is also the case that this flow is associated with another partial object and defines the other's potential field of presence, which is itself multiple. The synthesis of connection of the partial objects is indirect, since one of the partial objects in each point of its presence within the field always breaks the flow that another object emits or produces relatively, itself ready to emit another flow that another partial object will break, and so on and so on and so on. To quote Zizek on that last part, although I don't think he would say this entire thing. So because of this, the actual activities of the unconscious, causing flows, breaking flows, consist of the passive synthesis itself, insofar as it ensures the relative coexistence and displacement of the two different functions. The passive synthesis of connecting and the way that these functions operate, we can start outlining. Jack, do you want to expand?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what we talked about in the last round's table with like how what they mean by interpretation versus function, right? So we can interpret things according to like a representation, yeah, which isn't just Oedipus, right? It's going to be things like castration and that, and this kind of understand the unconscious as though it has a belief in myths, right? And it's kind of playing them out, right? Where you kind of deduce the unconscious or deduce your own kind of like there's really more subjectivity since it's going to be so that's what it was, right? You deduce your own subjectivity in that from these kind of representations, yeah. In contrast, Deleuze and Guattari are going to advance the thesis that we have to focus on functionality, right? So what do the partial objects do? How are they connecting? Why are they connecting? What structure is being kind of erected from this connectivity? So, right, this is the machinism and that, and the vitalism that's going to animate this, yeah? So far we're not talking about representations and that. We're trying to explain and look at how things are functioning directly, right? And then we can start dealing with problems like, are we stuck? Is there a serialization going on here? How do we create lines of escape, right? And I should clarify, when I said change the system earlier, I don't mean that I don't mean to take the focus onto the totality on that. What we're going to see is more that a line of escape doesn't change the system in the way you're thinking of like the preconscious, but as you open up a line of escape, we start to see flows moving, and in this sense, we see the territory actually changing, right? The connections and that are going to change, and the breaks as well.
Yeah, and as you start doing this, and you've broken down, again, these are not intended to be in order. Think of them like the three syntheses that are essentially happening almost simultaneously. As you go through this process, the goal is undoing the representation and discovering the partial objects and the desiring machines. To quote, the essential aspect of the first positive task is to ensure the machinic conversion of primal repression, thereto in an adapted variable manner, which is to say, undoing the blockage or the coincidence on which the repression, properly speaking, lies, transforming the apparent opposition of repulsion into a condition of real functioning, ensuring this functioning in the forms of attraction, production of intensities, allowing desiring machines to start up again. Because representations, through the improper use of the syntheses and the paralogisms, fuck up everything we do and they start creating primal repression in and of itself. The goal is, as we break one down and we discover the other, to start rearranging them and start allowing primal repression to be adapted back into sort of the unconscious and the way that it functions, to find these blocks, to find the paralogisms and completely eradicate them, ideally. This is the goal of kind of this setup. And they have a handful of things that they talk about very lightly as they go through this. And I think, let's go through, Jack, do you think the second task, and then we get into the, the 4 theses overall?
It's tough because what you just said leads me to want to talk about the second thesis.
I know.
Because it's very relevant there.
Let's jump to the second, because let's jump to the second, then we'll summarize the 3, we'll open it for questions, and then we'll talk through the four theses, because I think that's where we can start really diving into some very specific stuff. That's my thought. So I'm going to do it. The second positive task, and it's the final section of the book, is to, quote, separate the psychic investments of desire from the psychic investments of interest. This is not an easy thing to sort of grasp overall, because this is not like the first one where we're talking about molecular or anything of those. This is not having that discussion. This is about really understanding where a person's investments are from their desiring machines. And there's a lot of stuff in here that I think pisses some people off. I've seen some people get really angry when these things start getting discussed. So this will be fun. I'm going to give an example. Class is an investment that needs to be discovered about where it actually comes from, like the actual setup. Now we have names that we call classes. These are representations. The way that they talk about class and the way they talk about these investments and the things that need to be sort of taken down and reassessed here is the pre-conscious investment that a person actually has is not necessarily where they understand their class investment to be. Class is, again, a representation. So to say within social investments, they distinguish between the unconscious libidinal investment of group or desire and the pre-conscious investment of class or interest. That pre-conscious investment of class or interest is actually where a person's desire comes from. And if you want to, for example, have class awareness enough for, say, revolutionary activity at a large scale, it's not a matter of, oh, this class is being oppressed, this class. As Foucault said once, we can't tell who has power, but we absolutely can tell who doesn't. It's a really great line because, again, this is talking about that perception, the actual drives around me, what is pushing me to be invested in these class interests rather than the representation that sets them up. Because, as they say, every investment is social and bears upon a socio-historical field. We'll get back to that in a moment. I'm kind of rambling a little bit here, Jack. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to. So with the pre-conscious, it's not simply that that's where the person's desire comes from. It's that we're focusing on a segregative use or a segregative investment that is class, right? So first of all, the big move here is that class is no longer inherent. In fact, they're going to say class is a negation of caste, which is a very interesting claim, and the controversial one in a sense too, right? Although maybe not too much. So when we're talking about class here at the pre-conscious level, we're talking about a segregative use of the syntheses that is going to go into the pre-conscious in that manner. So we're focusing on, right, some very specific connections. We're focusing on basically a despotic signifier and a very particular subjectivity. So we've kind of narrowed the unconscious in this manner, kind of an either-or distinction, which is kind of how class works, right? You're either bourgeois or proletariat, or you're in the middle as a petit bourgeois, which is still bourgeois. So they're going to explain it in that sense of the segregative use, right? And then they're going to make the further claim that we can see how this plays out too, because like this is where they're going to talk about like Lenin and the Russian Revolution actually, where they're not going to say that it's they don't simply say it's like hogwash on that, right? They're going to say that what Lenin does is he and his party focus on the preconscious in order to basically direct desire in a certain sense. So in this sense, they're kind of sticking it or causing it to become stuck. Yeah. They're creating an exclusive, or rather they're mobilizing an exclusive, or rather segregative investment. And in this sense, they're going to give desire goals in this manner, the preconscious, in order to be working with to have like a purpose in that, is going to be segregated so as to seem to have a teleology, right? But desire doesn't really care about those things any more than unconscious. It cares about belief. So what we see here is a segregative use of the segregative investment being made through class, right? So as to accomplish certain aims.
Yeah, the line that they use is libidinal economy is no less objective than political, and the political no less subjective than the libidinal, even though the two correspond to different investments of the same reality as social reality. There is an unconscious libidinal investment of desire that does not necessarily coincide with the preconscious investments of interest, and that explains how the latter can be perturbed and perverted in the most somber organization, below all ideology. Again, going back to Reich's question that they've talked throughout this book. Why did the masses desire fascism? It's not that they were tricked. That's ideology. That's the concept of ideology. Oh, they were told that this is in their best interest. No, it's not that. It's that it is in their best interest as far as they understand, they know, and as far as they've been perverted. It's the way desire has been formed and the way that it has been utilized by representation.
Yeah, but it's not only them, right? Like this is a way in which the social machines and even desiring machines, since I mean I know we say desiring machines all the way down, but social machines all the way up, right? It's that Heraclitean point of the way up and the way down are the same. There you go. There's your paradox for the day. But to that point, right? It's not even. We're not talking about ideologies that Brooks is saying. We're talking about investments and the way those play into production, both um, thrice at the level of generation, productivity, and reproductivity, right?
Yes, to quote, it is doubtless true that interests predispose us to a given libidinal investment, but they are not identical with this investment. Moreover, the unconscious libidinal investment is what causes us to look for our interest in one place rather than another, to fix our aims on a given path, convinced this is where our chances lie, since love drives us on. This is the part where I really love how they're sort of, again, the machinic unconscious as a concept and how the desiring machines are trying to connect to everything. They're always trying to connect. But the preconscious investment basically lays out and says, here is how you need to connect. It's in your best interest. And it's true. It's just accurate that the interests predispose us to these given libidinal investments, but they're not identical. The real quick, Klosowski, they quote here on his commentary on Nietzsche, a form of power is identical with the violence it exerts by its very absurdity, but it can exert this violence only by assigning itself aims and meanings in which even the most enslaved elements participate. Quote, the sovereign formations will have no other purpose than that of masking the absence of a purpose or a meaning of their sovereignty by means of the organic purpose of their creation. It reminds me of the line, the greatest trick the devil played was convincing man that he didn't exist. This is that same type of thing.
Somebody's been watching Scrubs.
I've never actually watched Scrubs.
You've never watched? Oh my gosh.
No.
Well, there'll be time to talk about Scrubs.
You don't want to do that with me. I'm not a fan. Go ahead.
Oh really? Well, the time and place. Chronotope. I want to comment on that though because this is a very nuanced point that deserves some observation here. When we're talking about this interest here in that, you see what Klosowski's talking about. The function that's going to happen is that we're going to mask the purposelessness through purpose. That's exactly it. Desire, when it's being segregated in this way, still doesn't know a purpose. It's being caught up in a kind of circuit. right? A segregative circuit where the flows of the partial machines, right, through the either or disjunction on that, the differentiation is very, very limited, right? It's going to be this or that, and this propulsion, right, the way this is going to function, it's still not in service of a telos. It's still not in service of some sort of purpose. What's happened is that the network of desire has been narrowed, right? So it's not functioning so as to accomplish the purpose. It's rather that through a kind of purpose, one has segregated the investment, right? Has created the segregated investment, and desire will flow a certain way. Well, it will flow away that way, right? But not through. There's still a level of kind of unpredictability here because it doesn't know a telos, because it doesn't know belief, right? Because it's desiring.
Yeah, and I would say the when we were doing this rereading, we're setting everything up. There's a handful of lines that always stick out to me about the situation we currently find ourselves in as humans in today's world. But I'll say specifically, I'm an American. But I think it applies kind of a lot of places we're seeing, and that is at the bottom of 345. That is why it is so futile to attempt to distinguish what is rational and what is irrational in a society. To be sure, the role, the place, and the part one has in a society and from which one inherits in terms of the laws of social reproduction impel the libido to invest a given socius as a full body, a given absurd power in which we participate or have the chance to participate under the cover of aims and interests. The fact remains that there exists a disinterested love of the social machine, of the form of power, and of the degree of development in and for themselves, even in the person who has an interest, and loves them besides with a form of love other than that of his interest. This is also the case for the person who has no interest, and who substitutes the force of a strange love for this counter-investment. Flows that run on the porous full body of a socius, these are the object of desire, higher than all aims. It will never flow too much, it will never break or coat enough, and in that very way, how beautiful this machine is. I think is just a phenomenal. It feels extremely relevant. And again, what we're talking about here, if you've ever, and I've had conversations like this myself, where I'm trying to figure out why my father believes what he does, because Jesus Christ, Dad, you've, or why do people believe or request it? It's because of this. This is what they're talking about. This love of the system. This way that our investments are utilized and perverted. So we have to really get deeper than that and be very, very careful how we go about it. Because, again, the goal is to differentiate libidinal investments with preconscious investments. There's a difference.
Yeah, the unconscious with the preconscious, right? Because even, we're highlighting this example once again, right? That ideology, like goals, are always going to be secondary to desire. They're going to be something we kind of use to understand desire, right? But when we do that, especially if we're going to do it through teleology, there's a great risk, but we're risking not only a representation, but only a focus on the preconscious, as though the preconscious necessarily had to go toward that, right? Because of contingency, because of desires just not being teleological, right? It's not going to have that necessity. What's going to be necessary is more so the machinic connections with the flows that are going to differentiate those flows and cause breaks as well as new connections.
All right. Before we dive into the sort of four theses of this entire thing, are there any questions at this point? Really, anyone? Type away. You should be able to unmute yourself. If you haven't, please.
One thing they are constantly talking about in this sections about investments, and I still don't quite get what they really mean by investments. How far does, or how narrow this concept goes for them?
So as always, we'll ask our good friend Ken to help us out with any psychoanalytic nuance that we might be glossing over. But as I understand them, they're playing on cathesis and investment, right? So like one of the things that I've really enjoyed about Deleuze and Guattari is because of their engagement with capitalism. Yeah, it's not a process of negating it. So when they're talking about investments here, especially cathesis, they're talking about social and psychic investings or investments of desire that happen at the social level with the territory, but also happen in relation to the body without organs, right? So these investments are in relation to recording. Yeah. When we're talking about like the segregative and the nomadic here, or the, I think they call it the paranoiac fascist and the schizo revolutionary, which is, again, this is not delirium itself. These are two investments that play into delirium. What they're getting at here is how a process of production in creating this investment, whether it's a segregative or a nomadic, this is something kind of like memory, right? So the socius fashions memory. It does this through recording. It's part of the territoriality and it's part of the codification. These investments are very much tied into those codings and territorialities. So with something like a segregative, right, desire, and more so what's happening with in relation to the socius, and even with the body without organs as its tangent, we're seeing a kind of conservation happening. We're seeing a gregariousness, we're seeing a macrophysics or a kind of jurisprudence of the territory that focuses on the aggregate, that focuses on the statistical, the gregarious, that narrows things, narrowifies, makes things narrow. There we go.
Narrow.
English well I do.
I'll go with narrowifies.
Thank you.
I would also say I like Holland has a specific sentence I think applies to this is we're in a position now to understand the range of what can happen when subject groups may follow through to make use of these flows. Perhaps the worst case result is that they escape from dominant aggressions, so that schizophrenic investments involved have no social repercussions whatsoever. Better, they make what they are escaping escape by subverting dominant aggregations and their representations while in the process of escaping them. It's very much intended to sort of play against, again, representation as a concept, but things that are created at that gregarious level, I believe. That's a little bit more of my understanding of it.
Yeah, and the last move we need here is these investments, right? When we're talking about lines of escape in the lab, this is what those do. They create the revolutionary investment. So the schizophrenicus process is not going to be revolutionary by itself. Yeah, it's when this process produces a line of escape for desire from the assemblage, yeah, from the territory, that things follow in a changing manner, that we have a revolutionary investment happen. But these are investments, so we're talking about events, right? So this isn't like, this is again a criticism of teleology in a manner of speaking, but also there's a temporal element here. That is to say, we're not talking about an interminable process of investing, right? So I often criticize co-opting for this because it, at least in my take, presumes attack quickly that there's supposed to be this ongoing aspect, even perhaps a march toward progress, right? With investment, we have events that relate to the territory and the codes, right? That are contingent on the socius and the body without organs, that are bound up in basically whether or not we're going to see a change in the process of production. But in a given event.
Yeah, it definitely helps.
The other thing we should clarify here too is that these events, so when they talk about like Artaud's Eliogabalus, the crowned anarchist, right? There's this contradiction of something of a despot, yeah, which I think is fair to say of Eliogabalus. We would certainly say it of Caligula, but there's also this anarchistic aspect. So at one level, there's this paranoiac aspect of Heliogabalus, right? And at the other, there is this schizophrenic, this rule of contradictions that really don't get resolved but coexist. The other aspect here is that when we're dealing with investments, things like love or delirium act as matrices. So we're looking at investments that coexist simultaneously and in conflict with each other, but not in a necessarily resolving way. So we'll see things like we'll see these revolutionary investments, these lines of escape that have been made, right? These coordinations, but we'll also see the the more segregative ones too. We'll get just like with the hunter, right? We'll get the hunter who stops, right? And there's this kind of segregative aspect, but we'll also see the hunter that's nomadic and keeps moving. Yeah, these things coexist. They don't contradict. Well, they conflict with another, but they don't contradict into a resolution per se.
So Paul has asked about, and I'm going to quote him, elaborate on the original repression they talk about in the first positive task. He continues, is there a repression happening on the molecular level, one that doesn't require representation, or do they want you to find out where the representative repression comes from and how to free yourself from it?
I mean, you're going to be dealing with psychic and social repression, right? So you're going to be dealing with a representation that is displacing, right? So in the primitive territoriality, we have the creation of the incest taboo, right? Which actually has a positive function here, oddly enough. But, right, that has a social repression, which is going to be of the non-coded flows of desire. And that has a psychic repression in the sense that that plays into that more, shall we say, molecular level, where it's affecting how these flows and what's going to be nomadic in that sense are going to be possible in relation to the body without organs. Yeah.
So, and I think also it's worth mentioning, I'm going to read a bit from Holland here because I think when you're saying the original repression, I think you're talking about primal, which is in the translation, I mean, it is original, I think, in the original French text, whatever. Translations are fun. I'm going to read a little bit from Holland about it. The concept of primal repression, original repression, finally helps explain how it is that desire both differs from pure instinctual determination and becomes susceptible to capture by representation in the first place. But the crucial ambivalence of primal repression, which enables us to critically evaluate the effects of specific representations on desiring production and justifies efforts to intervene in the process, is betrayed when primal repression is confused with one socio-historically specific repressing representation of desire. The Oedipus complex, for example, which is then used to justify such repression as universal and therefore inevitable. Here, Freud mobilizes the fifth paralogism of psychoanalysis, the paralogism of the afterword, which in effect reverses the direction of determination. To say another way, there's an old, and I'm sure Ben has a better version of this, but there's an old Chinese fable of a man who gets a dog and ties it up and every day beats it. And then a few years later, someone's walking by and the dog viciously charges, but the rope and chain hold it back. And he says, well, it's a good thing I chained up and beat that dog. There's a little bit of kind of what's happening here with how primal repression is being affected. It's justifying its own case. It's justifying the original sort of repression that's happening. And primal repression is not a bad thing. It's good. There's a lot of shit that it does for us. It's like super positive. But that it can be captured and ruined by these same methods is the challenge that they have basically placed out for us. If that makes sense, Paul? Okay, good. I also want to quote Jared, who obviously really knows his shit with this stuff. It's a great quote. When they talk about looking at things from the perspective of desiring production, which they are very often through here, especially when they want us to look at socio-historical repressing machines. He says, the perspective of desiring machines is called universal history because it is transcendental. This is also why their philosophy has been called transcendental empiricism, because desiring production is material flux and active machines. All of history can be interpreted in the geophilosophy of the earth and the history of sexuality between these machines, to borrow from Foucault's book, which affirms schizoanalysis for historical method. It's a really nice, I really like that. Where the fuck have you been, dude? That's great. You should be around more. That's really nice. Yes. Any other questions as we're going through this? Bosgard, I'm guessing from how we're speaking of them. The essence of my question is that these tasks we're assigning to the analyst seem incredibly difficult, and conceptually it's easy to assign them, but difficult, if not impossible, to functionally carry them out. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. There's a couple reasons for that, and we'll be getting into them as we dive into sort of the four setups, the four theses of schizoanalysis. But again, the process is about essentially trying to, especially as we deal with it, and it's on the analyst here. I believe they would put it on the analyst to be the one who doesn't get caught up in representations. And generally, how they talk about this is by not being caught up in representations yourself and really trying to connect with desiring machines, these other things sort of also start falling apart. These tasks, like the syntheses, are sort of inevitable and intertwined as you start going through it, is how I understand their sort of overall thing. Again, it's not an easy task.
Part of the reason it might seem a tad daunting, though, is like, you know, they're obviously critiquing like a certain form of molar management here, right? Not to say that that's, you know, completely wrong, but that is kind of how we want to go about the revolution, right? Or like creating revolutionary, I don't know, things or whatever.
Potential.
Sure, whatever word we like there. But that is one thing they're really criticizing here, is this molar management, or like a gregarious management, right? So there's a very Nietzschean influence here.
Yeah, and as we'll get to, one of the things that naturally this also means is that you can't really have a goal. If you're going to sit there and go, cool, my goal is to make this person a healthy member of society, whatever it is, you're already, as an analyst, playing with representation. And by having the goal in and of itself, you've effectively created a fascist waiting. And they're just waiting for the time when they can start diving in. The goal here is to very much be playing in the space of the schizoanalytic process. And it's a process here. This is not a goal or a thing. If we start having a conversation, excellent, schizoanalysis is going to lead us to this form of communism, we've already fucked ourselves. It's going to lead us to this kind of behavior. That's not really the point. It's actually the opposite of the point, because at that point, again, you're playing with representation. And so it's about breaking that down and having the conversation in a very different way. Again, with partial objects as much as possible. Let's go through the four theses, which I think sort of, when it comes to what the actual practice is and what the actual things we ought to be looking for and how the process works, the four theses help me understand this a great deal more. So the first we went over a little bit, and I know we've got a lot to discuss on it, but it is the line, I'm just going to say it. Every libidinal investment of the unconscious is social, not personal, and therefore bears upon a historical field. So, where do I even start with this? I should have written more notes on this crap.
Let's start right with the beginning, right? So this goes right back to the first task. Every investment is social, in any case bears upon a socio-historical field. So we're dealing with territorialities, right? We're dealing with social production and desiring production, and we're not dealing with the familial in lieu of the social. Yeah, so when we do deal with things like the father and the mother, right? we're not going to be dealing with them as though they're the primary, or as though they're the kind of the fantastic representations of themselves that are the sort of I already used the word fantasy, but the risk of being redundant, the fantasy of the child as the primary or central aspect of analysis. We're instead going to do something different, which is to deal with investments not simply as psychological or individual in that manner, but in their multiplicity within the social and the psychic fields here.
And it is first and foremost a social investment. To quote Holland, even though it may be consciously perceived or expressed in personal or familial terms. Releasing schizophrenic desire from molar capture requires defeating the forces of paranoia throughout society, from the intimate confines of the nuclear family right up and to including the debt of capital. It requires full-scale social revolution. The nature of a lot of psychoanalysis, just in general, but also I would say therapy and a lot of mental health is very much focused on the idea of people's desires being focused on them personally, that they exist and that the goal of us is actually to properly socialize them. And if we can properly socialize them, then off they go. And I think this is the flip of them saying, well, actually, no, it's kind of the opposite, that everyone is properly socialized. This is what the society's done to them. And primarily their investments are in these social fields. So why don't we break down what those things are and really look at the libidinal investments as they exist and not sit there and go, oh, well, if we make you into these representations, but instead understand the representations are really the problem. And the second part is important there. It bears upon a historical field. These social investments are timely. They're contingent on the socio-historical sort of situations that a person may find themselves in as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going to be the name of the father or something that transcends history, right? We're going to have all the names of history. So it's as possible to be the simulacra of Heliogabalus as it is of Hamlet, but without making those transcendental, right? Without creating a new form of Oedipus.
And as we can see in this one, and the third sort of does this, but as we can start seeing the setup here at a basic level is when we're talking about a person's social investments, how they're sort of dealing with these things. The goal is to be battling against the paranoiac. The paranoiac investments are necessarily social, but they're also hierarchical, determinate, fascistic. Generally speaking, it's a pretty safe bet. And so when we start actually looking at the libidinal investment, we are pushing towards the schizo. We're pushing towards the other side of the process, the two poles of libidinal investment, as they say.
Yes, but to be very careful here, it's not about going against so this is a unique form, right? We're not going against the aggregate as this kind of like Quixote-esque battle or like a kind of Campbell-esque play, because I know Brooks loves Campbell. But more to the point here, this is about creating ways for desire to actually break out of that, So it's not even going to be us doing the battle per se, right? Because we're produced within this field and we're dealing with something that doesn't have a teleology. So we're going to be looking for ways to open up lines of escape. And that's why that that diagram is so important here. Because what they're showing us there is that we're creating breakthroughs, not in the form of like a regression, like in certain psychoanalytic movies, but more so we're opening up, we're creating the potential for the schizophrenic process to break through the body without organs here, as opposed to rebounding back onto those territorial representations.
Any questions to this first one? Again, very important. All right. Go ahead, Jack.
there's something else we should highlight before we move on to the second thesis, which is the selective process of culture, which I think kind of helps clarify what we're talking about here too, in terms of the social. So they're going to say the selective process of culture, it's not that we have gregariousness then selection. We don't have an aggregate that in turn produces what is going to be the culture, right? So this is kind of a play on the idea that the dominant class would produce the dominant ideas. Not exactly. Deleuze and Guattari are going to say the process is actually the molecular multiplicity. Then we have forms of selection performing that selection. And then we have the molar or gregarious aggregates that result from the selection. So there's a process of selection that interlinks the molecular multiplicity and the molar gregarious, or the molar aggregate. And this, to highlight one more point, right? The body without organs is going to be our sort of frontier between the molar and the molecular.
I like that. Thank you, Jack. The second of the theses is, to quote, there are two types of unconscious libidinal investment, desire and interest. Very short version of this is, because this is actually a rather simple point, the implications of it, I think, are significant and round out a much larger discussion that's possible. But the very short form of this is that the unconscious doesn't really have like interest. It doesn't like want a thing. It's things are connecting, shit's moving, the unconscious is kind of going. The interests follow. To quote them, they say interest always comes after. It's 346. To quote Holland, this follows from Nietzsche's insight that consciousness and its preconceptions are epiphenomena of larger unconscious forces. He calls them, at this point, will to power. They say, at 345, the unconscious libidinal investment is what causes us to look for our interest in one place rather than another, to fix our aims on a given path, convinced that this is where our chances lie, since love impels us in this direction. The manifest syntheses are merely the preconscious indicators of a degree of development. The apparent interests and aims are merely the preconscious exponents of a social full body. Again, the difference between the preconscious and the unconscious being where our desiring machines actually sit, where the primal repression is doing its damage. The preconscious, the investments, are after that. They come after this fact. They are not the things we need to fix. We don't need to tell a person what they should be believing and how. That's not the switch. We need to be able to digest differences here. And the ability for us to realize that as unique, because it tends to mean, in my reading of it, is that because interest comes after, we're talking about interest ultimately as being a manner of degree of force of desire. So your desire machines do all their shit, and then, quote, the degree of development of force is primary. For what that force is used, goals, aims, and corresponding interests of those who are invested in it, is secondary. It will always get rationalized after the fact. Desire and interest coexist, and interests have an undeniable role to play, for it is under the cover of aims and interests that desire invests the social full body. Nonetheless, the fact remains that there exists a disinterested love of the social machine, as I was reading earlier. The way desiring machines function and how they work exists before what we may consider our interests. Again, remember, the subject is not the thing that determines their desires. All of these things happen pre-subject. So this process is important as we start breaking things down and talking about why people are invested in, what they're interested in. It's not that we need to change their investment. It's that we need to change how their desire is functioning and where the repression is causing these investments to be expolied, having great deals of power and investment after the fact, after the unconscious generates what it does. That's my reading of it. Anyone want to jump in? All right. Well, so again, this part is just an answer to that. Why do people? It's not so much why people, when disasters happen, why people begin looting, but a question of why that looting is not sort of the standard all the time for those who are poor. So they would have looked at the riots that happened with BLM and not condemned the rioters, but wondered, why the fuck isn't everyone riding? Like, why isn't everyone riding all the time? It's a really good question. Go the other direction. Find out what their investments are. Where are they actually putting things? And then understand that beneath that is their desiring machines. And beneath that is the power that sort of facilitates those investments to take hold. So that's the second thesis.
To make a very small point, with the word interest, we're again talking about the preconscious here.
Correct. We're talking about class interest, for example, that you may be invested into at that point.
Yeah, class interest is a form of preconscious investment.
The third is, I think, the third thesis, to quote, the non-familial or psychotic unconscious libidinal investments have priority over the familial investments. To me, this is basically a almost logical step off of the first one, because as we start having these conversations, we're talking about getting rid of representations and these assumptions, and family is basically that. My investments into my family necessarily don't have precedence over my actual non-familial libidinal investments, because that's how desiring machines work, is how I read that. And maybe I'm reading it wrong. Anyone? The third one is basically them continuing to say that Oedipus is not determinate. Family as it exists now is not determinate. This is not who we are as humans is necessarily like this, but instead that things are, quote, born of an application of reduction to personalized images, which presuppose an investment. Oedipus is a dependency of the paranoiac territoriality. Again, going back to the idea of forget about the family, let's talk about how you connect elsewhere. The fourth of these theses is, to quote, the unconscious libidinal investments of desire have two modes, paranoid and utopian.
Paranoid. So we have the paranoiac reactionary and fascising, as opposed to the schizoid revolutionary, 366.
Yes, to quote, the two poles are defined, the one by the enslavement of production and the desiring machines to the gregarious aggregates that they constitute on a large scale under a given form of sovereignty, the other by the inverse subordination of molar aggregates to desiring production and the overthrow of power. The one by these molar structured aggregates that crush singularities, select them, and regularize those they retain in codes or axiomatics. The other by a molecular multiplicities of singularities that, on the contrary, treat the large aggregates as so many useful materials for their own elaborations. The one by the lines of integration and territorialization that arrest flows, constrict them, turn them back, break them according to the limits interior to the system. The other by lines of escape that follow the decoded and deterritorialized flows, inventing their own non-figurative breaks or schizzes that produce new flows, always breaching the coded wall or the territorialized limit that separates them from desiring production. It's always one or the other. It's a binary thing, as Jack was showing on the pendulum, for example, swinging back and forth or oscillating, however you want to actually phrase it.
Always be careful here, though, right? Because that pendulum is one way of dealing with it. Yeah. But for Deleuze and Guattari, they're going, I think, more to advance the second form, which is that line, right? So this polarity, yeah, there's a mutual contingency, reciprocality here. So, right, desire machines and social machines, you can't have one without the other, right? And both of them are collective, right? So it's not like the social machine is less collective. The thing that's going on here, though, is that when we have the gregarious investing in this manner, right, when differentiation is this segregative, yeah, where we're stuck, as we were saying, right, where we have that pipe that very little is being able to flow directly through the pipe, and instead we get this kind of burst that actually, instead of allowing us to flow directly through the pipe, we get a burst and the water goes underground and things change that way. Yeah, this is, I think, more so what's going on here for the gregarious, where desire machines, instead of having to follow the gregarious in that manner or being managed through the aggregate or the sub-aggregate, right? Instead, we're going to see how the territory and the codes in this, the connections especially, how this can all be changed through a line of escape as opposed to a segregative line.
I like that. So these are the 4 theses underneath it. Oh, Paul, please, is your mic working?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Ah, finally. How often have I tried? So, utopian, I think they're using the word utopian here because when schizophrenizing, the schizo always has to construct a new world in the desert, as they like to say. So he has to re-territorialize somewhere, and if he doesn't, his schizophrenic line of flight just moves in the empty room and he becomes a psychotic, right?
I'm going to hesitantly say yes, but actually that's a really complicated question. I'm going to have to think about.
It's going to depend on the assemblage we're looking at, yeah. So I'm actually, if we're going to talk about the utopic, I'd prefer we talk about in relation to a passage, because the word utopia it's just got too many connotations to just take it as is, right? But yeah, the schizophrenic process of deterritorializing and decoding, yeah, the productive that it engenders, yeah, there is a way in which that has perhaps a kind of utopic aspect, in the sense that there is a creative potential for the line of escape, right? For a revolutionary investment, right? But that would be in those potentialities. As for the schizophrenic, always going to be careful, right? Because we can talk about the schizophrenic person or like the psychotic, yeah. But then there's the aspect of the process, right? So like it's kind of that old joke where people read this book and were like, "Hey, we're all schizos now, right? The new proletariat, in a sense." That wasn't the point, right? The point was to understand this as a process, right? And more so, when they talk about like the schizophrenic person, we're talking about an assemblage in that process and its relationship to a body without organs. Because I think you're referring to like the 3 potential ways the revolutionary investment, or rather, the schizophrenic engagement with the body without organs can go.
Yeah, I just because it's always worth saying over and over. They are not saying that schizophrenia is a good thing. They are not saying a schizophrenic is a model. They are saying the process schizophrenia is a horrifying mental condition, especially in its full form. They do not mince words about this. Instead, what we need to do is look at the process that allows a hyperparanoid, a paranoiac, or a schizophrenic to interact with the world, how they actually deal with things. The paranoiac demands knowledge, demands everything be laid out, and essentially lays out and creates, we were having this discussion just recently, Jack, creates a diabolical machine that is on the other side of them, that somehow the world is always operating against them. They're able to construct this reality that gives them this absolute certainty. Opposing this, the schizophrenic is one who doesn't have an absolute reality, quite the opposite. They can barely make connections between the things that are directly in front of them. There's varying levels of that, but that is the poles they're talking about. They're not saying be either one of these. They're not saying that a fascist is a hyper-paranoiac, although probably some are. They're saying the process. The value here is to look at the process that enables these things and how they operate, and the freedom that comes with being able to not have to be invested into these large molar aggregates, these gregarious law of large numbers bullshit that people throw down on us, that I am an American, I am a white male, I have a beard. These are the things that represents, here's who I am, here is what I'm allowed to connect with. Instead, allow me to connect with how I want, when I want, as it happens. And if we can, ultimately, through this process of schizoanalysis, subvert, that's the fun part, subvert the way that the molar works to essentially being in service of the molecular, in service of the desiring machines. This is what they and Holland call a permanent revolution. And it's not a state that we can get to or a form of government or a goal. Again, by saying we have a goal, we've fucked up. So we've already introduced the fascist in the process. So when they're talking at this point about the schizophrenic or these things, they're referring to the processes within. Just because I still get angry anytime I see someone saying, well, we want to be schizophrenic, we inevitably get people in the server who have been diagnosed thinking that this process will cure them or something, and it's heartbreaking. It's just not the case. This is not a cure for mental illness. This is understanding mental illness and its processes to learn more about ourselves and how we can deal with the real world and change it for the better, hopefully.
Yeah, to that I would add, as far as the paranoid and schizophrenic go, right, they're deriving something out of those clinical conditions, right? That's why I highlight that it's not, you can go with the oscillating pendulum thing, yeah, and this kind of device, this kind of BWO in the middle of that, but this isn't really a universal clinical theory, is it? This is something else. So when we're talking about the schizophrenic and the paranoiac, they've developed these conceptualities out of those two, I guess, conditions, right? Psychological conditions, but they've really taken this somewhere different altogether. As far as that part goes, they do give something about a kind of psychiatry, if I can find it. 3 unavoidable conclusions. Let's see here. Be right back with that.
So while Jack's looking for that, so this is schizoanalysis broken down as they talk about through it. Now they give some very interesting sort of versions of this, but what I would like to do at this point is open up. This is most of chapter 4. We've discussed it in a good amount of detail. There's a lot of other things, obviously, to come in here. But please, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you have statements on this or opinions, please, this is where we are. I'd like to do that. And then after Jack comes back, we will then dive into how we can utilize this and what can be done with it. Because I think one of my hopes, we'll talk about it at that point. So first, any questions? Anyone? I will sit awkwardly in silence as I wait. So, Luis asks, so schizoanalysis has an important role in the end of capitalism? Yes, well, they certainly believe so. It's a process. Again, to think of goals is the wrong way, but let's instead think of it as if we can, for example, I'm able to talk to you, we get you, tossing out all your bullshit baggage, and you're able to get your desiring machines firing off again and connecting as they connect. And you can do it in what they would call a healthy place. And your desire machines are doing their thing sort of by nature. You then can start connecting with other people and doing the same. And it is effectively a bit of I want to say like a reverse infection. If Oedipus is a zombie that, goes around and basically infects everyone, makes them Oedipalized, triangulates them, and continues to move, which, as they've shown in this book, it does. Schizoanalysis is an interesting response to that, almost like the scene at the end of World War Z. I hate that movie, but where Brad Pitt infects himself with a sickness and suddenly the zombies don't really want him anymore. Someone who's been fully schizoanalyzed or makes their way through this process on the other side becomes more impervious to the way that a zombie Oedipus may function. So it's a unique way of sort of being able to move forward and have a process of existing that changes how you relate to those larger bits of repression.
Yeah, I mean, there is the anti-representational method, right? So that is absolutely part of it, but it's not, as I read them, it's not really about capitalism and like the molar aggregate, right? They're talking about, especially at the end of the book, they're laying out how schizoanalysis is concerned with creating a new socius, right? So just like with the primitive, with the despotic and with capital, right, those territorial representations, whatever socius we move to, those three territorial representations, those three territorial machines and those investments, they're coming with us. No, sorry, phone. Yeah, I think it's less about fighting capitalism, and it's more like, what does capital enable? Yeah, what are the conditions of capital as socius? How do we work with that to create these lines of escape? Which I think through a series of processes and investments, right? At one level, it's not just simply an ongoing process, right? This is like every event comes with investments, right? There's opportunities constantly, which is also kind of the hard thing about this, But with all these potentialities for investments, right? Especially like thinking about these segregative and nomadic usages, right? Looking at matrices of love and delirium, as they say, that is a way of creating escapes, and allowing for a new socius, right? Or at least working toward that.
Any other questions? We're going to give it a second. Again, I enjoy an awkward silence. All right. I'm going to assume that there's not any major questions on that. Either that means we explained it incredibly well, or too poorly for anyone to ask a question. I guess we'll find out later. So here's the question, and this is the one I want to end this, 68 episode podcast recording series thing that we've done here. This is the question I want to ask, and I want this to be a fully open discussion because this is what matters to me. And I said this very early on. I said it early in this chat here. Theory on its own is it's cute and fun, and I get it. But theory that doesn't have practice and practice that doesn't have theory, both are, I consider to be wastes of time. And I don't believe that this is a waste of time. So I'd like to have a discussion about how we might actually use schizoanalysis, the concept of universal history, this project that has been left at the end of AO, before we dive into logic ascents and at some point 1,000 plateaus. Let's have a discussion around how we can utilize this, or how this might be passed forward or used as a process. I would like to sort of leave it there for a moment.
Well, it seems like the first thing that you want to avoid doing are castrating moves. And it seems like, so castration being giving limits to love and knowledge. But it seems like there's an opportunity for a castrating move around every corner here, even with the 3 syntheses, suggesting and sort of reducing someone entirely to the 3 syntheses, even if that may be the case. Sort of producing them in that way removes space for so-called free play, which I think is an important aspect of this venture. And so we're reading this transversality paper, right, from Guattari, and I like what he's saying a lot. But at the same time, there's also this move where you could start enforcing things in specific ways to uphold some sort of dogma, or uphold Guattari's and Deleuze's original meaning and truth and stuff like that. And I think the point is that all this stuff is supposed to change. So that would be one point to put forward.
No, actually, I'm going to say that's actually probably the last point I should have ended on, which is all that we've discussed here is the contents of Anti-Oedipus. I mean, obviously, you've been listening to us do it for a long time, but the intention of the authors, and they say it very explicitly, is that this is intended to be a process. And the process as it stands then is intended to change, is intended to grow over time. To quote, completing the process, not arresting it, not making it turn in the void, not assigning it a goal. For the new earth is no more behind than ahead. It coincides with the completion of the process of desiring production, this process that is always and already complete as it proceeds, as long as it is proceeding. As we think of these things and as we go through this, any semblance of dogmatism, and I mean that quite literally, any semblance of it, any representations we bring in within ourselves, to Ken's point, is castrating. And we are the ones doing it, as the ones playing the role of an analyst, or the whatever we want to call it, schizoanalyst. The ability for us to absolutely go down the wrong path because we have a goal is awful. We need to ensure that what we do is we enable that free play, the as they would say, the love and open connection of the schizo. Is that fair, Ken?
Yeah, it sounds good. And I also don't know if it can be completely avoided at the same time.
Oh, I'm sure it can't. I mean, all of us who are here, I mean, I love all of you. I care about myself too. We all have shit. Like, there's only, like, we're all people. We're not just like a massive desiring machines who've, like, ascended beyond it, like Elon Musk wants us to do someday. Like, it's we're not that. We're people. We have shit. So yeah, for sure it's going to happen. For sure. But this goes to that saying with Deleuze I always use in my presentations I give on art and games, that a painter doesn't start with a blank canvas. A writer doesn't start with a blank page. Instead, the page already has written on it the tropes, the dogma, the cliches, the writing that came before. So the first thing a painter must do is destroy the canvas. Then finally, he may actually begin to paint something new. It's a great set of lines. I didn't say it exactly. I don't care because it's good words. It's good words. But I think that's the intention. And so as long as we're able to, let's say the server becomes a schizoanalytic project, because I'm just going to tell you, it's kind of what I fucking hope. Let's say the server becomes a schizoanalytic project. We pick subjects, we go about them. The nature of it, as we pick anything, is our own shit is going to come out as we go through this, and we will collide into each other. We will have discussions about things that will become difficult. My theory will hit blocks. That is the way that it works. That is the phrasing that they use, Foucault and Deleuze, when they're discussing how theory and practice merge. The reality of what we do then is we schizoanalyze that. It's a process. It is not, here is the result, and we sit out the result and we all go, oh, cool. That's not how it works. Schizoanalysis is about, here's my process, here's what I'm finding, here's these things, and then someone else colliding into that, and the multiplicity of parts that are flying together in the desiring machines produces something new and unique. And that continues as more people join and as more people join. That concept, that idea of this thing essentially always becoming is, I think, what schizoanalysis is intended to be as a process where we look at, for example, political happenings, things that are around us, businesses, assumed realities. And, well, deconstruction does a lovely job of deconstructing. Instead, is there a way for us to actually break down and find the drives of the people who are behind it, discuss where their desiring machines are at, what their representations that they're overly invested in are, where their repression is coming into focus, and how it surfaces and manifests itself. These things, as a sort of concept, I think are able to be handled if we handle it like a process. And that's the difficulty, I think, I've been having wrapping my head around, like schizoanalysis as a thing, because for a long time, I've followed the concept of like acid communism. We need to figure out and define something that comes after capital. And that's just simply not true. That's just simply not true. Defining the thing, Deleuze and Guattari would say that's not true. Defining the thing that comes after capital already has, again, created the fascist within, just by doing so. We've created interests that are going to define our desires rather than the other way around. So it's a very unique thing to consider that we're basically trying to start a process with no goal, and there is no success or failure, that we're just doing the damn thing, and we continue to just do the damn thing. That's how I view it.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it like jazz, to hopefully not to banalize it, but yeah, I mean, and this is what's difficult about it, right? Is we often want to take on the molar and the aggregate and manage it in that way, right? Manage large movements and build up these organizations and these larger groups and serialize them, actually, right? And to be serialized, yeah. And in this manner, too, we got to realize, too, that when I say we want, I mean, in this sense that we're produced in a certain manner, right, in this process. So we kind of don't have an intentionality in that sense, right? We find ourselves kind of part of the assemblage in that manner. But this is where it's different, right? Deleuze and Guattari is saying it's not really about going at that level, yeah? It's more about kind of the life of an improv, the life of one who improvs, there we go, improvises, where you're kind of dealing with every moment, yeah, every opportunity, every event, and the potentiality that that event has, right? So it's a way of looking very much at the immediate, and also in a critical light. So the way I usually look at this is very much to what you're saying, Brooks, is with the Foucault-Chomsky debate, right? Where at one level, one of the major contentions in that debate is Chomsky's idea of basically a teleology, right, or a consequentialism of anarcho-syndicalism, right? in contrast to Foucault's idea that we're not really, we don't have to do that, right? That's not necessarily the way we have to go about it, because there's a risk we have to address, which is the risk of reproducing the very thing we're trying to look for a way out of, right? So he's going to say we have to proceed by way of critique, in contrast to Chomsky's way of purpose, right? And that does mean too, like for Foucault, right? He's going to talk about how things change over time, right? Where he's going to say, like, for instance, were we wrong to criticize the clinic in the manner we did back then? No, because that was contextual, right? That is part of the temporality that we were dealing with, the context. But it's changed. And this is the difficult thing, right? This is why I often criticize the co-opting and authenticity aspect here, is that if you think you can perpetuate that kind of process where you're just constantly at war with this one thing, and you derive an existential territory in that manner, you're not going to be able to deal with change, right? And that's going to make that kind of project very difficult.
I would also say that very often one of the challenges with this, and it's, I think it was Mark Fisher's underlying point when he was discussing the Vampire Castle. The challenge that the left, because, and let's be very clear, this is a leftist thing. This is a universalist project. This is left. The thing that he was talking about is one of the difficulties very often is that the condemnation of people, the handling of how people who are or believe differently or handle things differently comes out in a very difficult way, and becomes challenged and becomes something as a point of contention. I think the underlying point would be, as we go through a process, say of schizoanalysis, for example, on this server, the necessity would also be that we allow people to be where they are and to connect how they're connecting. The intention of having, for example, Jack, you and I talk enough, generally speaking, I tend to know where you sort of land with. But for example, Joe, I think Joe's still in the chat. He's not going away. I would say we don't necessarily agree on everything. I think we agree on a lot, but not everything. The nature of how we may schizoanalyze or discuss such things is naturally going to push against each other and become points of contention, which I don't think is in itself necessarily a bad thing. Instead, we need to have a place where those connections, as they happen, as they are necessary, allow those connections to exist, if that also makes sense.
I think there are a lot of topologies, that take different directions with the same subject, which just keeps it interesting, So it's maybe not so much a matter of difference, but more a matter of which part of the repetition are you at, in what you are reading and discussing, because I think a lot of cybernetics and modern, I use it in a bad way, but of let's say now philosophy is kind of is not really stranded, but it's just picking up at different paces, basically. So you're not arguing about a subject matter, but you're arguing about pace in which you develop your own relationship with the text. And that's just a good thing because you develop as a person. I think every person develops differently. It should develop differently. And don't see us I mean, much disagreeing, just maybe at the different levels at some point, which I just find fascinating because you're often enough, further in some subject matter that I can hook onto, and that brings me to places, I haven't visited before. So, yeah, that's just something I like about debate, in all kinds of servers, and
I would
not
agree.
only yeah.
No, I would wholly agree. I would say that if let's talk about Nick Land and Mark Fisher for a moment, because I think the intention of what they were doing originally, I think sprung from the same fount that we are discussing here and that we've been talking about on the server of how do we do a thing, what can we do together? And this is K-Punk, for example, or the CCRP, or all of those different sort of groups utilized the technology that was available to enable a polyvocity. That was really the intention there, despite it ending up being fairly univocal, where we now know specifically Mark Fisher and Nick Land by name, and we kind of know how they write, and we kind of are able to have that conversation, which is, I think, different than the original intention, and I think different than the intention here. I think one of the things that's very unique, all this stuff that Jack and I have been talking about, all these notes that we've taken, the conversation you've just heard is not really Jack and I, although it is in effect. It's the culmination of Jack and I over the last 9 months, having these conversations with people, talking about it, having conversations live on this podcast that you've listened to, as well as in the texts with Varun, on our side chats, our other stuff. All of you people are part of this. This is, I can unequivocally say that anything I've said here is not necessarily something that I have learned or divined myself, but instead comes about because of my interaction with all of you. If we're able to continue to maintain that, this very unique thing that we've got here with a new type of technology that allows fast responses, quick turnaround, integration of text. We have CryptPad running, we have anonymous textuality, all these kinds of things, and we're starting to figure out how to do stuff. This becomes a very interesting project for us to begin doing real critique that actually can touch people in a very different way. Because again, and I'm not going to speak for Jack here, but this server is not intended to be Brooks's server, and it really hasn't been. This has been very much kind of everyone's. It's a really weird space. It's a fucking weird space. I will just say again, this is a fucking weird space. And so because of that, the tons of voices we're getting, the conversations we're having are very unique. And I'm on a lot of theory discords and forums, and it's just not the same. There's a difference. So for me, I would like to see that sort of intention of, if you want to have credit, I don't give a fuck, however you want to do it, but beginning to interact at that level where we're critiquing things as a group, having this conversation, schizoanalyzing, utilizing this methodology and improving on it and documenting the things that we're doing as we change things. Because their examples, some of those things, I mean, the examples just don't fucking apply anymore. But the way that it works, we've shifted, and there's changes in our world that are drastically different by how social machines operate at a large scale, how class works at a large scale, how imperialism works has even changed. All of this stuff has shifted in some pretty significant ways. And the ability for us to begin targeting that, having that conversation, breaking things down in a new way, I think we've got a real opportunity to produce something that is unique and different. And if we can do it via process without goal in mind, I don't know if we're going to do anything, but I think it'd be really fucking fun to try. So that's my manifesto. And you can meet me under the bridge at midnight. The password is 6 Semper Tyrannis. No, that's, yeah.
So, since you don't want to speak for me, I'll simply say that I actually come to the server for the awkward pauses.
Well, that's my rant at the end of that. I'd love to hear any of your takes. This is now, with that rant, we have marked really something extraordinary. No one, to my knowledge, has ever actually done a full reading of Anti-Oedipus as a group. Every Anti-Oedipus group I've ever been a part of has fallen apart and completely been destroyed. So this is unique. And I'm really excited that you guys were able to join me for this. And I'm just can't tell you how absolutely honored I am to be able to have put this together on a happenstance and found a way to make it survive. So I just want to say thank all of you very much. And it has meant a great deal to me. I've had a lot of personal challenge. We've all had personal challenges over the last year. I'm talking specifically about me, the subject. But it's been a very long 9 months, very long. And this has been a thing I've looked to every time we've done it, and it's just the best fucking part. So
Thank you, Brooks, for facilitating, by the way. That's also a job well done, I suppose. And I think you need a pat on the back, or maybe let me give you a pat on the back rather than having to wait for somebody to give you credit, because it's awesome that you made it this far, you know, and took it by, I don't know, just took it somewhere that it lasted.
well, it's all about. I thank you, and a lot of you have sent me very nice notes, and I do say thank you for that. It means a lot. But I will say, I generally do look at it almost in the reverse, that I've been cheating. See, like normally, someone who runs one of these groups is someone who does it because of some, I don't know, lots of different reasons. For me, it was simple. I literally started this because I don't understand anti-Oedipus or all of this shit, and I wanted to. And this was my way to trick doctoral students into teaching me. So this worked out. This worked out really nice for me because I genuinely think I kind of grasp anti-Oedipus, which is fucking crazy. Especially if you had heard what I thought of this book a year ago. I will not repeat what I thought of this book a year ago. It's a very different beast. So this has been basically my way of tricking all of you into teaching me. So it's totally worth it for me, easily. From here, it's very simple. The goal for us is very basic. Every Tuesday, I'm going to continue to do anti-Oedipus because this is a thing I intend to pay forward and continue with. I think an anti-Oedipus reading is a good way for people to just get into this, have that conversation. It is not going to be as much of a trudge. It's every Tuesday, however far we get, and then we do the next week and the next week. All of that is going to be placed on our podcast as well, which is great. So that's an eternal revolution, the eternal revolution of anti-Oedipus. Next week, we will be starting Logic of Sense, which is, I think, my new favorite book from Deleuze. I've been digging the chance to get into it. I cannot wait. We are going to be handling it a bit differently than this. We are going to be doing a close reading Mondays, same time, same place. But we're also going to be doing a second sort of closed group that takes questions that are raised in that to a group who are far more versed in it. We're fortunate that we have a handful of Deleuze scholars who are going to be helping us with that. So mods and admins are going to be taking your questions to a group, and we're going to be trying to do something a bit more organized, but also fully still open. We have no idea if it's going to work. We'll make adjustments as we go. The last thing is, from here out, I am going to start calling on what I now call the collective, all of you people. And we are going to start a schizoanalysis project where every week, maybe 2 weeks or something, we'll figure out the thing we're going to schizoanalyze. We'll create a little group for it. We'll create a crypt pad, a bunch of shit, collect everything we can, all of the thoughts, and we will combine them. And it will be a polyvocal, non-credited thing put specifically to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective. It's going to be the only thing that's attached to it. All of our names will be on the server, but that's not how we're going to credit it. And we'll be putting these out. We'll be seeing what we do and how we set it up. And I think it's going to be a really interesting opportunity to do some very cool stuff. So we'll see how that goes. If you want to join in with that, please say so. We'll be doing it inside of these chats. Keep an eye out for the announcement. It's going to be really excited. I'm really excited. It's going to be great. So with that, any notes, any comments, any last other things? I'm open. Anyone talk, have some fun. It's the last talk. This is casual time now. Yeah, I like the pauses too. I like the awkwardness, but yeah. So that's the plan. That's the setup, and again, I just want to end this by saying thank all of you. Thank our lovely Patreons who've made sure that despite my financial issues, the entire project is revenue neutral. And so everything gets to just keep going. Luckily, no one's making a dime. Luckily, no one's losing a dime. Hey, it's a perfect spot to be. It's exciting. So we don't get corrupted by the process. So just thank all of you for making that possible, and all of the mods and admins and anyone else who takes part in these every week or in the conversations or helps just keep the server running. Y'all are my fucking heroes, because I could not do this on my own whatsoever. This would fucking kill me. So thank all of you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream and the recording. Thank you, 26 YouTube viewers. What the fuck happened? How did that happen? Look at that, guys. That's like more than anything. Hell yeah.
Just 20 more than 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. I mean, we topped out at like 6 concurrent at any time, but it's 26 total people watched us today. That's exciting.